He thought inviting her on stage would be the highlight of the night, but it would become the moment no one in that room would ever forget. The grand theater glowed under warm golden lights, chandeliers casting reflections across polished marble floors as the city's elite filled every velvet seat, their tailored suits and shimmering gowns whispering wealth and status, all gathered to witness Victor Langford, a name that carried decades of prestige, a pianist whose reputation alone could sell out a 2,000-seat hall in minutes. And tonight, he stood center stage, basking in the quiet admiration of an audience that believed they were about to witness perfection. But Victor wasn't just known for his brilliance. He was known for his pride, the kind that lingered in the way he paused before playing, in the slight curl of his smile as applause began before he even touched a key. And behind that stage, unnoticed by nearly everyone, stood Clara Whitmore, dressed in a simple gray cardigan and worn flats, her hands gently adjusting sheet music. Her presence, so quiet it was as if the room itself had decided she didn't matter. Stagehands passed her without a glance. Assistants spoke over her. And even the junior performers treated her like part of the furniture, because in a place built on prestige, people like Clara were invisible. And yet, as Victor prepared for his performance, something small shifted. A single note from the piano caught his ear, not played, but tested, precise, deliberate, and he turned slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to notice her for the first time, his gaze traveling over her playing. Appearance, the absence of anything that suggested importance. And in that brief moment, a thought formed, not of curiosity, but amusement, the kind that powerful men often mistake for wit, the kind that begins with a smirk and ends in regret. And though the audience had no idea, though the murmurs and polite coughs continued under the glow of chandeliers, the night had already changed course. Because Victor Langford believed he controlled every note that would be played on that stage, he believed he decided who belonged and who didn't. But what he didn't know, what no one in that room could possibly imagine, was that the quiet woman standing just a few feet behind him had spent years mastering the very instrument he claimed as his legacy. And as the final preparations settled into silence, as the room leaned forward in anticipation, as Victor adjusted his cuffs with practiced elegance, the smallest spark of arrogance had already set something irreversible into motion, and in a matter of minutes, the same audience that came to admire him would sit frozen, questioning everything they thought they understood about talent, about status, and about the dangerous mistake of judging someone who never needed to be seen to be. Extraordinary Victor let the silence stretch just long enough to remind everyone who controlled the room before placing his fingers on the keys, and when he began to play, the sound was undeniably brilliant, every note crisp, every phrase deliberate, the kind of performance that demanded admiration rather than invited it. And the audience responded exactly as expected, leaning forward, captivated, offering soft nods of approval as if they were witnessing something rare. But behind the stage, Clara Whitmore stood still, her hands folded loosely in front of her, listening not with awe but with recognition, as though she had heard these patterns long before, as though the music unfolding in front of hundreds of people was something familiar, something almost predictable. And when Victor reached a particularly complex passage, one that required speed and precision, a faint shift crossed Clara's expression, subtle enough that no one else would have noticed, but it was there, a quiet awareness that something was missing, not a mistake, not an error, but something deeper, something only a trained ear would recognize. And as the final note rang out, the hall erupted into applause, a standing ovation building almost instantly, as Victor rose slowly, soaking it in, his chin slightly lifted, his eyes scanning the crowd with satisfaction. But then, as the applause began to settle, he raised a single hand, signaling for silence. And the room obeyed without hesitation, because when a man like Victor Langford asked for quiet, people listened, and it was in that moment, with hundreds of eyes fixed on him, that his gaze drifted again toward the side of the stage, landing on Clara, still standing in the same modest posture, still unnoticed by everyone else. And that same amused expression returned, sharper now, more deliberate, as though he had just discovered a way to extend his performance beyond music, into something far more entertaining. And without warning, he stepped slightly away from the piano, gesturing toward her with an almost theatrical flourish, his voice carrying easily across the hall as he spoke, inviting her forward in a tone that sounded polite but carried an unmistakable edge, the kind that turned curiosity into discomfort. And for a brief second, the room hesitated, unsure if this was part of the show or something else entirely, and Clara did not move at first, her eyes lifting slowly to meet his, steady and unreadable, as if measuring the moment rather than reacting to it. And somewhere in the audience, a few people began to murmur, sensing the shift, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. But Victor only smiled wider, confident, certain, completely unaware that the simple invitation he had just extended was about to unravel everything he thought he understood about control, about talent, and about the quiet woman he had just chosen to place under the spotlight. The room held its breath as Clara Whitmore finally took a step forward, slow and unhurried, the soft sound of her worn shoes against the polished stage barely audible beneath the lingering tension, and a ripple of quiet laughter spread through parts of the audience, subtle at first, then growing as people leaned toward one another, whispering assumptions, convinced they were about to witness an awkward interruption rather than anything of value. Because in a room filled with tailored suits and practiced excellence, someone like Clara did not belong. Under the spotlight, and Victor stood just beside the piano, watching her approach with that same confident smile, the kind that came from years of never being challenged, his posture relaxed, almost indulgent, as though he were granting a harmless favor. And when Clara reached the bench, she paused, her gaze resting on the piano for a moment longer than expected, her fingers hovering just above the keys without touching them, as if reconnecting with something distant, something deeply familiar. And the silence stretched, long enough for discomfort to begin creeping in, long enough for a few people in the audience to shift in their seats, uncertain whether to laugh or wait. And somewhere in the front row, a man let out a quiet chuckle, breaking the tension just enough for others to follow. But Clara did not react, her expression calm, her shoulders steady, completely untouched by the atmosphere surrounding her, and Victor tilted his head slightly, a hint of impatience now slipping through his composed demeanor, as though the moment was not unfolding as quickly as he had planned. Yet he said nothing, confident that whatever happened next would still serve his purpose, because in his mind, this was still his stage, his narrative, his control. And Clara slowly lowered herself onto the bench, her movements precise, almost deliberate, not hesitant but measured. And when she finally placed her hands in her lap, the room fell into a strange, uneasy quiet, the kind that arrives when expectation begins to shift into uncertainty. And for the first time that evening, the audience was no longer entirely sure what they were about to witness, because there was no nervous laughter from her, no apologetic glance, no visible sign of someone unprepared, only stillness, a deep, unwavering stillness that seemed to absorb the noise around her. And Victor's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so slight that most would have missed it. But it was there, a flicker of something unfamiliar, something he could not immediately define. And as Clara lifted her hands from her lap and gently placed them on the keys, the air itself seemed to tighten, the whispers fading, the scattered laughter dissolving into silence. And in that suspended moment, just before the first note was played, the entire room unknowingly stood on the edge of something they would not be able to forget. The first note did not arrive loudly. It arrived with precision, a single tone so clean and controlled that it cut through the air like glass. And in that instant, every whisper disappeared, every shifting movement froze, because there was something unmistakably different about it, something that did not belong to hesitation or chance. And Clara Whitmore did not rush, she did not try to impress. Her fingers moved with a calm certainty that felt almost out of place in a room built on performance, and the melody began to unfold slowly, deliberately, each note placed exactly where it needed to be, not a display of speed, but of control, of understanding, of mastery, so quiet it demanded attention rather than begged for it. And within seconds, the atmosphere changed, the earlier amusement dissolving into something heavier, something closer to disbelief, because this was not a simple tune. This was a composition layered with complexity, one that required years of discipline, and yet Clara played as if it lived inside her, as if she was not recalling the music but remembering it. And Victor remained standing just beside the piano, his posture stiffening almost imperceptibly, his confident smile fading into something tighter, something uncertain, as his eyes fixed on her hands, watching movements that were too precise, too effortless to dismiss. And as the tempo began to build, Clara's fingers moved faster, but never out of control, each passage flowing into the next with a clarity that felt almost unreal, and the audience, once so eager to laugh, now sat motionless, their expressions shifting one by one as realization began to settle in. Because this was not luck, this was not imitation, this was something far beyond what they had expected. And somewhere in the second row, a woman lowered her phone, no longer interested in recording a joke, because there was no joke left to capture, and the music rose, richer, deeper, pulling the entire room into its rhythm. And for the first time that evening, Victor Langford was no longer the center of attention. He was a spectator, standing only a few feet away from something he could not control. And as Clara reached a passage known for breaking even seasoned performers, her hands did not hesitate. They did not falter. They moved with a confidence that erased any remaining doubt. And a hush fell so complete it felt almost physical, pressing against every seat, every breath, every expectation that had existed just minutes before. And Victor's expression shifted again, this time unmistakably, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening slightly as the truth began to form, a truth he could not easily accept, because the woman he had invited as a joke was now revealing something he had not prepared for, something that threatened the very image he had built. And as the final sequence approached, faster, more demanding, more unforgiving, Clara did not slow down. She leaned into it, her movements becoming sharper, more precise, and the room, once filled with quiet arrogance, now sat completely still, suspended in the realization that everything they thought they understood about this moment was about to collapse. The final passage arrived like a storm that refused to break, fast, relentless, yet impossibly controlled, Clara Whitmore's hands moving across the keys with a precision that no longer invited doubt but demanded recognition, and every person in that grand theater felt it, the undeniable shift from disbelief to realization, because what they were witnessing was not just skill, it was mastery at a level that did not need validation. And the last sequence, the one that separated the exceptional from the truly rare, unfolded without a single hesitation, each note landing exactly where it belonged, clean, deliberate, and devastating in its perfection. And when the final chord rang out, it did not explode into the room, it settled into it, deep and resonant, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost unreal, as if the entire space had forgotten how to breathe, and no one moved, no one clapped, not yet, because something had shifted beyond performance, something that left the audience suspended in a moment they could not immediately process. And Victor Langford stood frozen just inches away, his expression no longer composed, no longer controlled, his eyes fixed on the piano as though searching for an explanation that refused to appear, because there was none. There was only the undeniable truth unfolding in front of him, the truth that the quiet woman he had chosen to mock had just delivered something he himself could not replicate, and the weight of that realization settled heavily, not just on him, but on everyone in that room. And slowly, almost cautiously, a single clap broke through the silence, then another, and another, until the entire theater erupted, not with polite applause, but with something deeper, something urgent, a recognition of what they had just witnessed, people rising to their feet without hesitation, their earlier amusement replaced with awe, their expressions reflecting a mixture of shock and respect that could not be faked. And yet, in the center of it all, Clara did not bow. She did not acknowledge the applause. She simply lifted her hands from the keys and sat there for a brief moment, her gaze calm, steady, untouched by the noise surrounding her. And then, without a word, she stood, stepping away from the piano with the same quiet composure she had carried all night, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if the performance that had just silenced an entire room was simply something she no longer needed to prove. And as she walked past Victor, she did not look at him, not out of defiance, but because she did not need to, because the silence he now carried said everything that needed to be said. And in that moment, As the applause continued to echo against the marble and gold, one truth settled over the room with undeniable clarity: that greatness does not announce itself, and those who underestimate it rarely understand it until it is far too late. The applause did not fade quickly, it lingered, echoing off the high ceilings and polished walls as if the room itself was reluctant to let the moment end. But Clara Whitmore did not slow her steps. She moved with the same quiet rhythm, passing through the edge of the stage as though she had never been at its center, and behind her, the energy remained, restless, charged, people turning to one another with wide eyes, whispering questions they could not answer, because no one knew who she was. No one understood how someone so invisible could deliver something so undeniable, and Victor Langford still had not moved, his hand resting lightly on the piano, his posture fixed in place as the weight of what had just happened settled deeper with every passing second. And for a man who had built his entire identity on control, on mastery, on being the unquestioned center of attention, this silence felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. And as the applause finally began to soften, replaced by murmurs that filled the space, Victor slowly turned his head, his gaze following the path Clara had taken, as if trying to hold on to something that had already slipped beyond his reach. And for the first time that evening, there was no performance in his expression, no carefully constructed confidence, only a quiet realization that something had shifted in a way he could not reverse. And near the front rows, a few members of the audience stood still even after the others had begun to sit, their attention still fixed on the empty piano bench, as if expecting the moment to repeat itself, but it did not. Because moments like that do not repeat, they simply remain. And as the stage lights continued to glow, Victor finally stepped forward, placing both hands on the piano as though grounding himself. But when he looked out at the audience again, the atmosphere had changed, the admiration was still there, but it was different now, no longer unquestioned, no longer absolute. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the heavy curtains and polished hallways, Clara continued walking, unnoticed once more, her presence blending back into the quiet spaces she had always occupied. And yet, what she left behind refused to disappear, because in that single performance, she had not only played the piano, she had shifted the balance of an entire room. And as the murmurs grew louder, one question began to surface again and again, passed between strangers, carried in hushed tones, lingering in the air long after the music had ended, not about the piece, not about the technique, but about her, about who she was, and how someone like that could exist in plain sight without anyone ever realizing it. And Victor, standing alone under the lights, heard those whispers, felt them settle around him, and understood something he had never needed to consider before, that there are moments when talent does not compete, it simply reveals, and when it does, it leaves behind a silence that no applause can fully erase backstage. The noise of the crowd softened into a distant echo, muffled by thick curtains and long corridors lined with framed portraits of legends who once stood where Victor had stood, and Clara Whitmore moved through that space without urgency, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, as if the storm she had just left behind had never touched her. And a young stage assistant paused as she passed, glancing at her with a flicker of confusion, as though trying to reconcile the quiet woman in front of him with the performance he had just witnessed. But he said nothing, because there was something about her silence that did not invite questions. And further down the hallway, the faint hum of voices grew louder, fragments of conversation drifting through the air, names being mentioned, guesses being made, theories forming, but none of them reaching the truth. Because the truth did not announce itself, it moved quietly, just like she did. And inside the main hall, Victor Langford remained near the piano, surrounded now by a small circle of organizers and patrons, their voices polite, but edged with curiosity, each of them asking in different ways the same question: who was she? And Victor listened without answering, his eyes distant, his mind replaying every note, every movement, every detail he had missed before it was too late. And for a man who had spent years anticipating every outcome, this moment offered no preparation, no script, only a quiet confrontation with something he could not explain. And as one of the organizers leaned in, suggesting that perhaps the woman had formal training, perhaps she had studied abroad, Victor finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of its usual certainty, saying only that he did not know. And the admission hung in the air longer than expected, because it was not just an answer. It was a shift, a small but undeniable fracture in the image he had built. And in the hallway beyond, Clara reached a side door, her hand resting briefly on the handle as she paused, not out of hesitation, but as if acknowledging the space she was about to leave behind. And for a moment, the distant sound of applause echoed once more, softer now, fading into memory. And she stepped outside into the cool night air, the city stretching quietly beyond the theater, unaware of what had just unfolded inside. And the contrast was almost jarring, the stillness of the street, the distant hum of traffic, the ordinary rhythm of a world that had not witnessed what the room inside had felt. And Clara breathed in slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not in relief, but in familiarity, because this, the quiet, the anonymity, the absence of expectation, was where she had always belonged. And back inside, the questions continued, the murmurs growing louder, the curiosity turning into something more urgent, because people were no longer content with applause. They wanted answers. They wanted a name, a story, something they could hold on to. But the truth remained just out of reach, moving further away with every second, and Victor, still standing under the fading lights, understood something that no one else in that room fully grasped yet, that some moments do not exist to be explained. They exist to be remembered, and the more you try to define them, the further they slip beyond your understanding, leaving behind only one undeniable fact, that the quiet woman he had once overlooked had just rewritten the entire night. Without saying a single word, the city carried on as if nothing had happened, headlights passing in slow lines, distant sirens echoing faintly through the night, and Clara Whitmore stepped onto the sidewalk without looking back, her figure blending seamlessly into the quiet rhythm of people who had places to be and no reason to notice her. And inside the theater, the energy had not settled, it had transformed. What began as admiration for one man had turned into a restless search for answers, voices overlapping, questions repeating, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Victor Langford finally moved away from the piano, not with his usual controlled confidence, but with something slower, heavier, as though each step carried a weight he had not expected to bear. And as he reached the edge of the stage, he paused, his eyes drifting once more to the empty bench, replaying the moment in fragments, the first note, the silence, the shift, the realization, and for the first time in years, there was no immediate explanation waiting for him, no conclusion he could claim as his own, only a truth that had unfolded without his permission. And as he stepped backstage, the conversations quieted slightly, not out of respect, but out of curiosity, people watching him now with a different kind of attention, no longer just admiration, but expectation, as if he might provide the answer they all needed. And one of the senior organizers approached, his voice measured, asking again who she was, how long she had been working there, why no one had known. And Victor stopped, his gaze steady but distant, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might reconstruct the narrative, reclaim control with a confident explanation. But instead, he exhaled slowly and said nothing. And that silence carried more weight than any answer he could have given, because it confirmed what everyone was beginning to understand, that this was not something planned, not something curated, but something real, something that had revealed itself without warning. And outside, Clara reached the corner of the street, the glow of the theater lights fading behind her, replaced by the softer, colder light of the city, and she paused briefly at the crosswalk, her reflection faintly visible in a darkened storefront window. And for a moment, there was no audience, no applause, no expectation, only her and the quiet presence she had always carried. And a passing car slowed slightly, the driver glancing at her without recognition before continuing on, and Clara stepped forward as the signal changed, crossing into the flow of ordinary life without hesitation, leaving behind a night that would be talked about long after she disappeared from it. And back inside, Victor stood alone in a corridor lined with mirrors, catching a reflection of himself that felt unfamiliar, not because he had changed, but because something around him had. And as the distant sound of people still discussing her echoed through the hall, one realization settled deeper than the rest, that for all his years of mastery, For all the control he believed he held, there were still moments that existed beyond him, moments that could not be orchestrated, only witnessed. And as he turned away from the mirror, the question remained, not just in the minds of the audience, but now in his own, not how she played, but who she truly was, and why someone like her had chosen to remain unseen until that exact moment. The story did not end inside that theater. It lingered, carried in conversations that stretched late into the night, in headlines that would quietly begin to circulate, in the subtle shift of how people remembered that evening, not as a flawless performance by a celebrated pianist, but as the night something unexpected stepped forward and changed everything. And Victor Langford sat alone in his private dressing room, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the polished surfaces, his reflection staring back at him from the mirror, not with the confidence he had worn for years, but with a question he could not silence, because for the first time, it was not about perfection, it was about perspective, and the realization settled slowly, not as a blow, but as a quiet truth, that greatness does not always arrive announced. It does not always carry titles or recognition. Sometimes it stands quietly in the background, waiting for nothing, needing nothing, until the moment reveals it. And outside, far from the noise and curiosity, Clara Whitmore continued her walk through the city, passing storefronts, streetlights, and strangers who never looked twice. Her pace unchanged, her presence as unassuming as it had always been. And yet, what she carried was something few would ever understand, not the need to prove, not the desire to be seen, but the quiet certainty of knowing exactly who she was. And that certainty did not depend on applause. It did not rise or fall with recognition. It simply existed, steady and unshaken. And somewhere behind her, the echoes of that performance would continue. People would search for her name. They would speculate. They would try to fit her into a story they could understand. But some stories do not belong to the world's expectations. They exist outside of them. And back in the theater, long after the crowd had begun to disperse, one thing remained, not the music itself, but the silence that followed it, that rare, unmistakable silence that arrives when something undeniable has taken place. And in that silence, a lesson settled, not spoken, not announced, but felt by everyone who had been there. That respect is not granted by status. It is earned through truth. And that underestimating someone based on what you see is often the first step toward revealing what you failed to understand. And as the lights dimmed and the doors closed, the memory of that night remained, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful presence in the room is the one no one thought to notice, until it was far too late to